Hello, welcome. I'm Melinda Crane, and here's what's on this week's agenda. Syrian refugees, wide open doors in Sweden, but are other countries doing enough? Syrian split at the G20, diplomatic debacle for Germany. And jubilant Japan wins its bid for the 2020 Olympics, but could Fukushima spoil the show? And we have three expert guests here ready to lock horns over this week's headlines and what's behind them, starting with Carmen Schmidt. She's an expert on Japanese politics who teaches political sociology at the University of Osnabrück and also serves as speaker of its Japan Research Center. And we're pleased to welcome Markus Kaim. He is head of international security research at the prestigious German Institute for International and Security Affairs. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Zurich, and he's taught in Germany, Canada, and the US. And finally, it's a pleasure to welcome Susanne Schmelter. She is the author of several studies on the situation of Syrian refugees. She's currently writing her PhD at the University of Göttingen, and she attended the University of Damascus until shortly before the crisis began. So since we've got two Syrian topics on this week's agenda, and we've been hearing the drums of war beating ever louder the last couple of weeks, I'd like to start out by asking all of you one short question, and it is in regard to this newest proposal that we're seeing from Syria and Russia, that Syria should give its chemical weapons into international control by the UN, for example. Who among you actually believes that a political solution to this crisis is possible? Carmen?
Well, I think maybe we can avoid the military strike now, but whether this will lead to a political solution, I'm a bit skeptical about that.
Markus Kaim, what do you think?
I fully agree with the notion. The Russian initiative, if fully implemented, will maybe help to control this chemical stockpile of Syria, but it does not provide any political solution to the civil war in Syria.
And Susanne Schmelter?
I agree, and I'm skeptical that this will give the way free to a political solution, but it's maybe a first step towards a political solution. And if there's any possibility to avoid a military strike, I think it's necessary to take it, because, in my opinion, a military strike would only further escalate the situation in the region.
Images of dead children poisoned by gas have brought home the staggering human toll in Syria. But there is another measure of that toll less visible to many of us who live outside the region, and that's the mass displacement of the living. Almost 1/3 of the country's population has been uprooted in what the UN Refugee Agency recently called the great tragedy of this century. Are those who are arriving on European shores getting the help they need?
Germany says it will offer sanctuary to 5,000 Syrians from this month. It is taking in more refugees than any other European country apart from Sweden. Germany has received praise for its help, but the welcome is not always friendly. Most Syrian refugees are living in makeshift camps in neighbouring states, and the total number of people in need is staggering. The United Nations says at least 2 million Syrians have fled their country.
What is appalling is that the first million fled Syria during 2 years. The second million fled Syria in 6 months.
As the conflict continues, the exodus is sure to persist, and the humanitarian problem will worsen. Where will all Syria's refugees go?
Susanne Schmelter, tell us, first of all, please, what you're hearing from friends and acquaintances in Damascus. Are they making plans to leave?
Yes, they make plans to leave. They try to leave. Some have left already. They stay now in Lebanon or Turkey. And others try desperately to leave and have very few opportunities to do so. One friend there has a Palestinian background, and for him the borders to the neighboring states are mainly closed. He could go to Lebanon, but the living expenses are expensive there. And from there, he also doesn't know where to go. He often asks me what to do, and he tells me the journey to Europe would cost $10,000. And I feel helpless, and he's completely stuck. And I have another friend who has many connections to Europe. He has even a Schengen visa. And he tried to transfer his business here, but still he has a family with 2 small kids. And he had difficulties to open a business here. And even if he comes here and applies for asylum, it would take too long time to leave his family alone there, to apply for family reunification, and so on. So they are in very different situations, but they have very few opportunities to leave the country. And they all changed already their houses in Syria themselves, so they are internally displaced already.
Now, we have just heard Germany has made this offer to take in 5,000 Syrian refugees. How satisfied are you with that response?
Well, it's a good step in the right direction, but it's certainly not enough. Seeing that there are 2 million people outside Syria in often very precarious, desperate conditions, that many try to go to Europe, to access Europe via, for example, the Aegean Sea. They are often dying in the Mediterranean. And there I see a kind of hypocrisy that Germany presents itself now as a good humanitarian actor, which is a good step. But on the other hand, Europe leaves people to die in front of its own borders.
Just to put that number, that 5,000, in perspective, Markus, Kaim, 5,000 is actually the number that leaves Syria in 1 day. 1 day. Now, a Green Party politician here in Germany has just said Germany should be taking in not 5,000, but 50,000. But frankly, isn't that a bit delusional, given the fact that we're seeing demonstrations right here in Berlin against an asylum center for just a couple of hundred asylum seekers?
I'm not sure about the specific numbers which can be accepted here in Germany, but I think the point is right, that we see a lack of political leadership. I mean, on the one hand, the foreign policy establishment clearly has stated over the last 2 years, Syria is facing one of the worst humanitarian disasters we have seen in the last 20 years in the European neighborhood or European periphery. And at the same time, we're accepting only a handful of refugees. And one side narrative of the debate is that, at least to a certain degree, the politicians or the political class has focused on Christian refugees being accepted, Christian Syrian refugees being accepted to Germany. And I think the overarching approach should be inclusive, as inclusive as possible, and not specific, not focusing on specific religious groups.
Carmen, Schmidt. Good arguments, but the fact is refugee numbers have already been rising to Germany because of the economic crisis in southern Europe. We've seen a great deal more immigration this year. So is it really realistic to think Germany's going to open its doors wider to the Syrians?
I don't think that it's realistic to take 50,000 or something like that. But the 5,000 are a good step. But given the fact that we have 2 million refugees, I think the number is too small, so we should take more refugees, but I think we need a European perspective on this matter, I think.
Let's talk a bit more about that European picture. Susanne Schmelter, as we heard in our report, Sweden has said it's going to open its doors wide. It's going to give residency to any Syrian refugee who makes it to Sweden. Why can't other European countries take the same approach?
It's a good question. Well, Sweden had already, in the Iraqi refugee crisis, quite liberal policies towards refugees. And after some time, it became more restrictive because other EU member states did not do alike or shared this responsibility. So I think also now Sweden needs to have other states in Europe who support these policies by accepting also refugees, because like this, all refugees would try to come to Sweden because they would have most perspectives. But
the fact is, though, it's not that difficult for Sweden to make this kind of offer because it is not the point of first entry for most Syrian refugees, is it? Can you explain that system to us? You mentioned it briefly. They tend to be coming by water through the Mediterranean. That means they wind up in countries like Italy. Isn't it bearing a much greater burden here?
The EU border states like Greece, Italy, maybe some try to come via Bulgaria, they are usually obliged to, except for Greece, there's a regulation that people who enter Europe via Greece are not referred back to Greece. But usually the Dublin regulation says that the asylum claim has to be proceeded in the country where they've arrived. So it's true that Sweden or Germany don't receive asylum claims like this, but still people try to go to these countries because the prospect for getting acceptance are still higher than in those countries.
Markus, Carmen Schmidt said we need a European solution to this. What are the prospects that we're going to get that?
I mean, we have the pillars of a European migration and asylum policy, but as you have indicated, the perspectives of different EU member states are very different. We have the countries in the Nordic countries which have a tradition, a history of accepting refugees since World War II, being very open, but they're, as you have said, they are not affected by the huge numbers. Countries like Italy, like Greece, have to shoulder the biggest part of the burden of the European refugee flow into the European Union. And at the end of the day, European governments emphasize to a certain degree it's the part of the national sovereignty to determine who's coming in and who's left out.
If you look at some of these Nordic countries' biggest challenges in the years to come, Carmen Schmidt, you might think they would be welcoming refugees, namely the demographic issue. All of the Northern European countries are facing shrinking, aging populations. Couldn't immigrants, and apparently many of the Syrian immigrants tend to be well-educated immigrants, couldn't they be an answer?
Yeah, sure, that can be an answer. And as you said, a lot of them are really have good education, and so we can need them, surely. And I think that is a good idea, yes.
I think it can be an answer to one part, but the refugee policies should be for people in need. It should not focus to get only the well-educated and to leave the others out. There are still other programs for migration, and I think they should be used properly. And people usually don't want to become refugees. They would prefer to go as normal migrants to get a working visa or any kind of visa. So it would be good to channel this way and to give visa to the people who can work, who have an education, student visa, and so on. And the rest is for refugee status should be for the people who are in need, who are maybe not useful for the society or something.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Let us briefly, because we're coming to the end of this particular part of our discussion, but let us briefly return to the region itself, the Middle East. As we mentioned earlier, the greatest burden, of course, is falling on those neighboring countries to Syria. Lebanon, Jordan, Markus Kaim, these are very poor countries, especially Jordan, one of the lowest amounts of water in the world in Jordan. Jordan has taken in an equivalent of refugees as if 33 million Mexicans had arrived on U.S. shores. What does this mean for the political stability in the region as a whole, to have these huge streams of refugees?
Actually, it's a surprise that the political systems of the neighboring countries are still pretty stable. I mean, they have to absorb huge numbers of refugees in a very short time, which is a burden not in economic terms, not only in economic terms, but also in terms of social durability and social cohesion for societies which are already fragmented along ethnic and religious lines. And how this already has affected other neighboring countries can be seen when we look to Lebanon and when we look at Iraq. I mean, the Syrian civil war is not only a civil war anymore. It has spread already to Lebanon, and at least to Lebanon and Iraq, and it runs danger to affect Jordan and Turkey as well.
And it's become a war of religion across the entire region. One last question to you, Susanne Schmelter. Are these refugee flows actually a reflection of a reality that we do not want to face, namely that the Middle East is being reshaped into Sunni and Shiite zones, and that there is essentially ethnic cleansing going on there?
Well, I think it's difficult to read it like this because it tends to stress those fault lines even again. But it's true that the whole conflict was is getting more and more fought along the sectarian lines, and that there's also the fragmentation of the Syrian society, and also that refugees look where to go, where they have relatives or members of the same religious community. So there might really be some reshaping this direction.
Thank you very much. Well, it's not only the refugee side of the Syrian crisis that is testing diplomatic mettle. At last week's G20 summit, leaders argued over Syria late into the night, and Germany at least found itself with strange bedfellows the next morning, casting its lot with Russia, China, Brazil, and Argentina rather than its EU partners. It's not the first time that diplomatic indecision left Chancellor Merkel looking like a professional fence-sitter.
At last week's G20 summit in Russia, Germany didn't sign. Chancellor Angela Merkel was the only major EU leader not to back a U.S. initiative blaming the Syrian government for a chemical attack on civilians. Just a day later, after a meeting of EU foreign ministers attended by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, Germany made a U-turn and decided to sign after all. Speaking at an election campaign event, Merkel defended the late signing.
We had to do everything possible to get a joint position of the 28 member states, and we succeeded. We can be proud of that. And then we could sign the G20 declaration.
It's not the first time that Germany has seemed to wobble over military intervention in crisis areas. In 2011, it abstained on a Security Council resolution for a no-fly zone over Libya. Merkel's critics say she's a vacillator. Others say Germany is taking a moral stance. Is Germany on a zigzag course on major foreign policy issues?
Markus, the shilly-shallying at the G20 and afterward was eerily reminiscent of Germany's stance on Libya. What's going on here?
I think 2 points are maybe important. First, for the United States and other countries, it's easy to ignore Germany. Germany's foreign and security policy can be ignored. It's simply not important anymore. Germany is important in economic terms with regard to European integration and the European recovery after the debt financial crisis, international financial crisis. But in terms of foreign security policy, it's possible to neglect Germany. And the second point is...
But is that where Germany ought to be as Europe's most important economic power?
Absolutely not. Absolutely. In my view, Germany is punching below its weight, not above its weight. And it's not for the first time that the German political class is confronted with very specific and very high expectations towards taking a clear stand on a certain issue. And at least currently, nobody's talking about a military contribution, but about a clear political standpoint about the situation in Syria.
Let's take a brief look at exactly what was at stake at the G20. There was this declaration. It did contain one sentence that could possibly be construed as support for the U.S., even if it went ahead with military action. Now, given the fact that we're in the middle of an election campaign and that Germans are notoriously shy about military power, wasn't it quite understandable that Angela Merkel wasn't going to sign that?
But actually, the German government is facing the same problem of credibility the U.S. president is facing. I mean, the German government has emphasized for the last 2 years or even more, President Assad must go. His time is up. He has to leave his office, and has made very clear which side the German government is on in Syria. And at the end of the day, that means that Germany has to take a clear point with regard to the use of chemical weapons in Syria and the political prospects. And that has been the problem in Vilnius, regardless of the question of the cohesion of the European foreign policy.
Let me ask our other two guests how they see it. Would you want your country to sign on to a sentence in a declaration that possibly could be construed as supporting military action, Carmen Schmidt?
Personally not. And I think what the Germans did was to say we need a European line. We discuss this with our European partners.
But the European partners were there in Moscow at the G20 meeting. Couldn't they have discussed it there?
Okay, but they had a meeting the day after, and they wanted to await such a position. And I think it's very good if we say we want to have Europe. Then we should have a Europe foreign policy and not German policy. And so I think it was quite understandable.
Susanne Schmelter, couldn't one also make quite a different argument? The argument that's traditionally made here is we had a terrible experience with military power, we perpetrated terrible crimes, and we refuse to get involved in using military power again. But couldn't you also look at this the other way around and say a country that gassed millions of people is one of the first that should sign up to strong efforts to prevent the use of chemical weapons ever again?
I think it would, against this background, it would be good to be very reluctant to take military action. And for this reason, I think it's good that they refrained from backing the US that strongly, but Germany has no other position. It has no clear strategy towards the Syrian conflict, and it should have set on means to find a peaceful solution or a decisive early strategy to calm the situation, or maybe even for military action. But in this situation, it's going to escalate, I think. But it's good that, I mean, Germany has its NATO partners. It has to show some consistency in its position and to stand beside its partners. This is really a problematic point also.
Markus, Kaim, could you say that Germany in some ways learned the wrong lessons from history, or learned them too well and has been unable to adapt to its new circumstances?
I mean, we had the debate about what to learn from our history very specifically with regard to the Kosovo decision 15 years ago, when the Green Party almost split exactly. On the one hand, you had those saying our Nazi past, our military past requires us to be on the side of those who are looking for political solutions. And on the other side, you had those arguing, particularly because of our historical burdens, we have to shoulder a specific responsibility to avoid cases like Rwanda, like Srebrenica, like Libya, and a situation like in Syria that can lead to very uncomfortable, hard decision-making, and that is a discussion which has never ended in Germany.
In some ways, Germany almost seems to have backtracked since that time in Kosovo.
Absolutely.
One of the very strong arguments made at that time was what Susanne Schmelter also just said. It's not only the letter of the law that counts, it's not only this pedantic attachment perhaps to abstract principles, but also what are your friends doing? Mm-hmm. What are your allies doing? Which side do you want to be on? It sometimes seems that Germany has moved backward from that decision that was taken in Kosovo.
And additionally, it's a question of moral orientation. I mean, a sentence like "to be a force for good in the world," it's a sentence or a self-description which is used in the United States. The United States is a force for good in the international system, and in the UK as well. But this notion has been never accepted in Germany as well. And as you have said, the problem has been since Libya, one of the worst nightmares for German foreign policy since World War II, to be on the wrong side against our traditional Western allies and be on the side of those countries which are the rising powers in the international system, India, Brazil, China. But at the end of the day, it did not pay off. China, India and Brazil reacted more irritated than happy to be embraced by Germany.
And in many ways, that club that Germany joined by not signing at the G20, Carmen Schmidt, is a club of countries very unwilling to take responsibility, countries that we often call for China, for example, to become a stakeholder in the system. Is Germany itself acting enough as a stakeholder in the international system?
Well, when we are talking about this third case, we should say that if Germany has learned something from the past, is that we should await what the UN Commission will say on that investigation. Was it gas? Who has done this? And so I think that we should await this investigation and then decide on that matter. And one more thing, that international law does not back any military strike, not even in the case of such a gas attack. It can't be, or it has to be condemned, but it does not say that we should give a military strike to someone.
Markus, Kaim, are there not Chapter 7 UN Charter arguments that can be made if it's proven that a country has used chemical weapons?
Absolutely. The situation in Syria, even without the use of chemical weapons, can or could be qualified as a threat to international security. But it's up to the UN Security Council to qualify it as a threat to international security and authorize all necessary measures according to Chapter 7.
Susanne Schmelter, do you really believe the UN is capable of taking meaningful action here? We haven't seen it do so in the past 2 years. Russia completely blocking action in the Security Council. When you look at your friends and their suffering in Syria, do you really have any faith that the UN can sort this out?
Not really, no. It seems to be quite a deadlock at the moment. That there's a block constellation with Russia on the one side, US and different allies, where it's really difficult to get a political solution in Syria, and it's actually far beyond Syria. The conflict is not only Syrian conflict, so many different actors are intertwined in this constellation, that it's difficult, but finally it has to be found maybe in the Security Council even. I mean, at least the big players have to get on the table too, the international players.
Certainly, Markus, Kaim, we are seeing some movement now in terms of the Russian and Syrian proposal that we mentioned at the top of the show. What do you think? Is it a delaying tactic, or might it actually be able to defuse at least the issue around the chemical weapons?
I think the initiative has taken off the option of a military strike from the table. For understandable reasons, the US president will be happy to embrace the Russian initiative. As always in politics, the question is in the details. Under which circumstances are this chemical weapons stockpile, is this stockpile handed over to the United Nations? Who's going to supervise the abolition of these chemical weapons? Who's going to pay for it? How long does it take? And so on and so on. And the biggest problem is the civil war with more than 110,000 people being killed, unfortunately, will continue.
Carmen Schmidt, are you hopeful that we will see a way out that does not involve military action?
I am hopeful, yes. But maybe this is just a hope. But we have seen that something is moving, and so I hope that this is a first step and that we can see a political solution in the future.
Thank you very much. Well, questions like, who can you trust? How credible is the information that we're getting from our leaders? Those questions are at the very heart of the debate over Syria's chemical weapons and what to do about them, and they're also key issues in our third story on today's program. Japanese leaders are counting on the 2020 Olympics to boost the country's economic upswing and to prove that it's back on top after 2 lost decades. But are they giving us the full story on further fallout from Fukushima?
Just last month, the Japanese government announced plans to restart nuclear power stations shut down since the 2011 earthquake and tsunami that caused a meltdown at the Fukushima plant. Now, the latest alarming data from Fukushima shows that the nuclear complex is leaking much more radioactivity than the operator TEPCO previously claimed. South Korea has responded to the news by banning imports of fish caught in the Fukushima region. But Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe insists the situation is under control. His assurances at least convinced the International Olympic Committee, which awarded the Olympic Games to Tokyo. Will Fukushima be under control in time for the 2020 Olympics?
Carmen Schmidt, do those assurances convince you? Is Fukushima stable and secure?
Absolutely not. And I have two concerns at the moment. The one we have seen here are the leaks. So it was confirmed that we have leaks with radioactive coolant water that leak into the ocean, and with, well, a lot of radiation going into the water. And we have seen that South Korea has banned fishery products from 8 Japanese prefectures. And the next point is that in November, TEPCO tries to remove the spent fuel rods from reactor number 4. And this is a very urgent task because that building is in a very bad situation, and every small quake can lead to a collapse. And if they are removing these spent fuel rods, they contain deadly plutonium. This is a very delicate task, because usually you need the help of computers. But now it has to be done manually because it's damaged. And if something does go wrong, this can really lead to a catastrophe.
On the other hand, 2020 is quite a ways off. Japan has some of the world's top scientists and research experts working on this problem, and it's very much in their interest to get it under control. Are you not confident that they're going to be able to do so?
Well, I have the hope that with that decision, the Japanese government will do its utmost to get things under control. And I also do hope that they will come back to the global community to seek for help to get things under control. But I think that the Olympic Games will be a good point.
Markus, Kaim, apropos seeking help from the international community, apparently a German expert recently refused to visit the site, saying that he was concerned for his personal safety. Would that seem to you to be an overreaction here?
I'm not an expert on the situation in Fukushima in particular, but it seems to be a more political problem for the future of, for Japan. I mean, what I read and hear about the relationship between the government, the supervising authorities for the nuclear sector, and the power company, TEPCO, reminds me of something which we actually know not from developed countries, but from third world countries, which we call bad governance, in which there's obviously, at least to a certain degree, no necessary amount of transparency, control, accountability, and that is, in my view, the biggest problem, regardless of the current situation in Fukushima.
Japanese prosecutors, interestingly enough, Carmen Schmidt, just this week decided not to charge TEPCO bosses in connection with the initial phase of the disaster. Seems surprising. Is this just a cultural issue, or is there a profound lack of accountability here?
It's very hard to say who is accountable for that, because there are also political reasons for that. And as you said, the controlling was very bad and things like that that did not take into consideration that there might be a tsunami. Is that the responsibility of TEPCO, or was it a political responsibility? And so I think it's quite understandable.
Susanne Schmelter, how would you feel about, say, visiting that region at the moment? Would you worry about your personal safety, or would you trust the Japanese assurances?
No, after all what I've heard, I would be worrying. I'm also not an expert about the risks and what exactly is going on and in which degrees it might be harmful or not. But it makes me worry. I wouldn't go there.
Would you eat some fish?
No. No. No.
Let's take a little poll. Markus, Kaim, would you eat fish from that region? As we just heard Korea talking about issuing a ban, would you eat that fish? Would you trust it?
I wonder how easy it is to identify a fish from this particular region, but however, I would try to avoid it.
I'd like to come. Well, we'll just find out if Carmen Schmidt would eat the fish first. We'll do the poll.
No, I don't eat that fish. No. I try to avoid it, yes.
Let me come back to the cultural issue. There was a report issued by a parliamentary commission in Japan saying that Fukushima was a man-made disaster because of Japan's, quote, culture of reflexive obedience. Are you seeing any signs that that has been followed up on, that that culture of reflexive obedience to higher-ups through hierarchies is changing?
That is definitely changing, yes. I think this is changing, but I don't think that we should say this is a cultural or something like that. It was a man-made disaster. It was not taken into consideration the specific situation in Japan with the earthquakes and tsunamis and things like that. And I don't think that we can say this has some cultural background. And what is to say with nuclear energy, that many Japanese back nuclear energy, and this is because Japan lacks gas, other natural resources like gas or oil or something like that, and it was cheap energy. And
they are, of course, now bringing nuclear plants back online. How much support for that is there within Japan?
Well, as I said before the disaster, many Japanese backed or majority backed that. Since the disaster, this changed dramatically. Today, around 80% of all Japanese say that they want to phase out nuclear energy. On the other hand, nearly 70% say that some of the reactors have to bring back online to secure power. So it's a little bit a mixed picture, but what we see, and that is good, is a growing awareness concerning nuclear power, concerning the alternatives, and the pros and cons. And so I think this is a positive situation.
Interestingly enough, when we talk about what changed after Fukushima, one of the places that changed its policy most drastically, Susanne Schmelter, was your own country, here in Germany. The Energiewende, the shift toward renewables, away from nuclear, away from fossil fuels, is itself running into some trouble now. Are you expecting to see a backlash here in your own country as well?
Backlash towards nuclear energy?
No, backlash away from the Energiewende.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good that the Energiewende is coming, and it was probably the point which really made it coming. But, well, it's a long way. I hope it will be successful and that they have enough patience also, because it's only a small percentage of the general energy. But I think it's worth exploring it and augmenting the amount of natural energies. But yeah, I hope.
Markus, Kaim, we've seen the Energiewende called into question during the election campaign here in Germany at the moment. Was it ultimately an overreaction by your country to Fukushima, and would you expect to see major changes after the election?
I don't expect major changes in terms of returning to nuclear energy, but I think now a lot of people have simply see the consequences of the Energiewende and now get a more, let's call it, more sober perspective, that the Energiewende means also higher energy prices. And for a lot of German households, that is an issue, not for the high-income households, but for the low-income households. So the question of Energiewende has become now in the election campaign an issue for or has been connected with social security. And that, I think, will define the agenda for the next 4 years to come.
Returning to Japan, but staying with that economic theme, Carmen Schmidt, Japan, as I mentioned earlier, has faced 2 decades of recession, zero growth, very big economic problems. Many people, of course, hoping that the Olympics will pull Japan out of this dark, long phase. Do you think it's right? Can it do that?
I'm not sure whether it really can do that, but I want to come back to one thing, that Japan is on its way to renewable energy, or greening Japan. We should not oversee that fact, even though the Japanese government is pro-nuclear power. But what's going on behind the surface is really impressive, because if we see what's happening, Japan is now, behind China, the second fastest growing market for solar energy. And when it comes to the capacities that are already installed, it's just behind Germany and Italy. So it's very impressive. It's just a start, but we see a greening of Japan.
So people taking renewables seriously.
Yes.
How seriously are they taking these Olympic Games as a boost, as a sign Japan is back? That's what we're being told. Is it true? Did the population feel that way?
Yeah, if you look at Tokyo, the people are celebrating this decision. So for the people, it's something, going back to normal, and that's very important for them. So yes, and many have the hope that, it will boost the economy, of course. The Japanese government wants to show the world we have overcome a crisis, a very severe crisis. And so, of course, for the people, it's a good thing, and they are celebrating.
Markus, Kaim, what do you think? Olympics can be a two-edged sword. Would you expect that they will really do for Japan what Japan is hoping?
I mean, it depends. I mean, we have a couple of cases from the past in which countries paid a lot of money for the infrastructure, and after the end of the Olympic Games, the stadiums were simply ruins. They have never been used again. So it's a question of proper planning. And from my view, from what I see, the last Olympic Games in London seem to be very successful in terms of investment into infrastructure, but for example, Montreal in the 1970s, economic and disaster in terms of infrastructure.
Susanne Schmelter, very briefly, I asked you if you would eat the fish from Japan. Would you travel to Japan for the Games?
I would, I think.
Thanks very much to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of our viewers out there for tuning in. Don't forget, you can watch the show again online. Just go to our website, that's dw.de/English/agenda. And do write us a mail and tell us what you think. Bye-bye.